welcome all to this 7th annual symposium on wilderness, wilderness, and imagination. And for this talk, 43 countries, 5 continents, writing on place and the travels between by writer and director of the creative writing at UC Davis, Pam Houston. For making this happen, we must thank the generosity and the hard work of the Bioethics Program, the Center for Excellence of the Arts and Humanities, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Creative Writers Milieu, Ecology, Evolution, Organismal Biology Department, Environmental Studies Program, the Geological Atmospheric Sciences Department, the LAS Miller Lecture Fund, the MFA Program in Creative Writing and Environment, the Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture, the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the government of the student body. I first heard about Pam Houston a few years ago. Her short story collection, Cowboys Are My Weakness, was on the shelf of the woman I would ask to marry me. We had just started dating, and she had just moved into a new apartment. Cowboys was one of the few books she had unpacked. She mentioned something about the quasi-religious regard which she and her best friend held that book, because the stories in there are about relationships grounded firmly in reality. And as I found out, they were stories in which men certainly do more than their fair share of dirt. So upon reading Cowboys, I knew my girlfriend was already on to my nonsense. And that's because there's truth in Pam Houston's fiction. An Atlanta Journal-Constitution article review said this: Houston is at her best writing about the wilderness and people who want, maybe need, to live in it. Ms. Houston's stories reach beyond interpersonal relationships and include people's relationships with the natural world. After winning the Western States Book Award in 1993, Ms. Houston explored environments beyond the American West in her writing and in her own travels, visiting 43 countries on 5 continents. Her second story collection, Waltzing the Cat, and her book of essays, A Little More About Me, moved between the West and places like Bolivia, Tibet, and Pennsylvania. They are about people figuring out how they will fit in with the places and people around them. And if that isn't what life is all about, I guess I've been going about it all wrong. Her works have won the Willow Award for Contemporary Fiction, received nods from Best American Short Stories and Best American Short Stories of the Century, and include the O. Henry Award and the Pushcart Prize. Ms. Houston was interviewed by Powell's David Weich about her novel, Sighthound, a story built from the relationship with her own dog, Dante. Weich noted this: in the progress of things, Houston says, it was time to write about a few good men. That one of those men happens to be a dog, well, who would call it a surprise?
Hello. Hello, all. It's very nice to be here. How's that? Does that sound good? You've been hearing me cough all day, and I will just say that, yes, I had the terrible 3-week-long croup, and yes, it's over, but the cough remains, so hopefully I will, normally I don't let my students drink water during their readings. It's one of my things that they're always mad at me about. I always say, cowboy up. God, everybody's listening to you. Why do you want to watch them drink water? Why do they want to watch you drink water? But I'm going to keep my water handy tonight in case I need it. I realized just now in the car talking with Ben that that the very first time I read from this book that I'm going to read from tonight was to Ben in Wisconsin, to Ben and some other people in Wisconsin when I had just started it. And I started this book, which I have literally, I'm actually going to add 2 sentences on Monday, and then it's gone. I mean, I've been through all the edits with my editor and everything, so it's really out of my hands as of Monday. So this is the end of a long process that began in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was asked to be part of an evening called Unveiled at the Wisconsin Book Festival. And what they told us to do in Wisconsin was to write something. They told 3 or 4 or 5 of us, some number of us, to write something that was totally untested and untried for that event, and that would be its coming out party. And I took the assignment so literally that I didn't start writing till I got on the plane to Wisconsin. And I wrote it in about 36 hours leading up to the reading. And I did what I tell my students to do when they complain of writer's block. I say, just write down what you've noticed lately. Write down anything in the world, in the concrete physical world, that has glimmered at you, that has arrested your attention. Write it down, and before you know it, there'll be a scene. And so I did 12 of those. And that was my unveiled piece. They were 12 very short chapters. And I read them, and I thought that would be the end of it. Well, I'll tell you one more thing, since we're so close to Wisconsin. I went, at about 2 hours before the reading, I thought, I better make sure I did everything I was supposed to. So I went back and I looked at the email, and it said, the only caveat is you have to mention Wisconsin, which, of course, I had not accidentally done. And because I am hardly ever in Wisconsin, and so none of these 12 glimmery things that arrested my attention in the concrete physical world had happened in Wisconsin. So I went downstairs and I sat on a street corner until something happened. And then I went back upstairs and I took out Mexican Hat, Utah, and I put in Madison, Wisconsin. And so then I had done what I was supposed to do. And so I read it that evening and thought that would be the end of it. And Richard Bausch, who was there that night, who's a friend of mine and someone whose writing I really respect, said, well, do 100 of those, and it's your next book. And I thought, well, no, not 100, but maybe 144. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think in 12s. So lo, these 6 years later, I have finished the book. And there are 144 very short chapters that make up this book. There are 11 sets of 12. And in between each group of 12, there's a story that takes place no place on an airplane. It takes place in the sky. All the other places are titled with the place they occur. And I don't know what else I really need to say about it. I guess just in the spirit of this gathering, and to reiterate something I said earlier on the panel, I know not all of you were there, but for me, it is always the concrete physical world that makes me want to pick up the pen. Now, I say that very broadly. It could be mountains and rivers, as it was when I first came out west. It could be, a terribly depressed person's basement. It could be, out in a boat, seeing an orca for the first time. It could be in a Whole Foods, in what I call today the meanest spot on the planet, the Santa Fe Whole Foods. Everybody competing over tea and veganese. But whatever it is, it's the concrete physical world that it's the things happening out there that always make me want to pick up the pen. I never think to myself, I have a great idea for a character, or, I'd like to write about my complicated relationship with faith, or I never think in terms of story or character. I think there's something, write it down. And so this book is that. This book is sort of and it's really, not to try to sound grand or anything, but it's the way I honor. It's an honoring process. It's the way I feel grateful for the things I get to see and experience, and that's a really big, important part of it for me. So in a sense, these are all little prayers in my own non-religious way. So what I'm going to read to you tonight is from this book. You will notice I haven't called it anything, and that's sort of intentional. Norton will be calling it a novel, which is great. That's fine with me. It is a book-length manuscript of prose, and the main character's name happens to be Pam, coincidentally. But other than that, it's a novel, and we can talk about that during the Q&A if you want to. But I'm going to read you some of these sections. I'm going to go a little heavy on the airplane stories because Ben likes them. So you'll hear an airplane story, and then you'll hear maybe one from somewhere else, and then another airplane story. In the book, there would be lots more in between the airplane stories. So this is how the book begins. The airplane stories are named with the call numbers of the flight. So this is UA 863. We are 2 hours out of Sydney when the pilot's voice comes over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, he begins, I'm sorry to tell you this, but our instruments up here are indicating fuel system failure. We're on the phone with Central in Chicago. They are advising us, and we've contacted Sydney Air Traffic to let them know we're headed back. You can probably tell we're making a big turn right now, and we're going to get you back on the ground just as quickly as we can. I pull my headphones out of the seat pocket to listen to the tower communications. I hear the words 747-400 heavy right before the channel goes dead. All around me, people are turning back to their conversations and their magazines, rolling their eyes and shaking their heads, like, oh, those crazy airlines. I listen for a shift in the tone of conversation and do not hear one. I ring my call button. Am I the only person on board who has experienced fuel pump failure in a car? The problem isn't that we don't have enough fuel, the handsome, in a rangy, Greyhound-esque way flight attendant says. The problem is we've got too much. Our max landing weight is 630,000 pounds, and we're probably over that by 200,000. We've got 2 giant overwing fuel tanks, and the captain can't tell which tank the fuel is coming from. If it's all coming from one side, it won't take long before we have a serious balance problem. Not to mention if it stops altogether, I say. Right, he says. I tell him I'm feeling a little panicked, and when I'm feeling a little panicked, information usually helps. When we get close to Sydney, we'll circle once to dump fuel, he says. Then I'm betting he'll put us in crash position. I know how to get into crash position. I've been in crash position an inordinate number of times. We roar back to Sydney like a bat out of hell. The next time the pilot's voice comes over the speaker, there is less apology, more bravado. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are getting ready to land this airplane about 170,000 pounds heavier and about 60 miles per hour faster than regulations allow. The Sydney 240A runway is the longest in the world, and we are about to use every square foot of it. In a few minutes, the flight attendants will demonstrate modified crash position. I watch my friend the Greyhound cross his arms over his head and brace against the imaginary seat in front of him. When the demonstration is over, he stops in the aisle next to me. There's a good chance we're going to blow a tire, he says. It might be uncomfortable for a few minutes, but generally speaking, when a tire blows, nobody dies. And then he's off. We are getting close enough to the ground now to feel how unnaturally fast we are going. I thought we were going to dump fuel, I say, to no one. Oh, not the bankrupt airline, says the Aussie next to me, who was supposed to be going to his sister's wedding in San Francisco. Do you have any idea how much 60,000 gallons of jet fuel costs? Not to mention the EPA fines. That's the Great Fucking Barrier Reef out there. Not to mention, I think, if they pick the wrong wing to dump the fuel from, we are all of a sudden upside down. Never has a plane felt so heavy and sounded so loud. We hit the runway hard and unimaginably fast. But we don't bounce, and we don't swerve, and we come to a complete stop beyond the white lines, beyond the navigation lights, just before the blacktop turns to dirt. A cheer goes up inside the cabin. This time the captain's voice is softer. Ladies and gentlemen, he says, welcome back to Sydney. Your patience and cooperation is greatly appreciated. As you might imagine, our brakes are a bit overheated at the moment. We will sit out here for something just under an hour to let them cool. And then a technician will come out and inspect them to see if they have enough grab left to stop us at our designated gate. At that point, you'll disembark and you'll be directed to buses that will take you to a hotel for the evening. We'll get a good night's sleep and try this thing again tomorrow. When we get off the plane, The terminal is deserted. All the grates are pulled down over all of the snack bars and newsstands and duty-free shops. There is no one to greet us at customs or passport control, and we breeze right through like it's the end of the world and there are no more countries. Once we are on the bus, a lone customs official boards and puts a big red stamp in our passports that says, "Did not depart," which gives me pause. If we never left Sydney, then who were the people on the plane they were so sure was going to explode on impact with the ground that they evacuated the entire terminal? Who were the people who they had already assumed would be reduced to fuel dust and ash? This is number 59, Tucson, Arizona. I have not been on the property 30 minutes when I am lying on a massage table in a softly lit, frangipani-scented room with a person named Daryl towering over me. I can see, he says, that you are doing a lot of spiritual work because look how far you are out in your hair. His accent is vaguely South African, and he has the most impressive unibrow I have ever seen. I do not read poetry, Daryl says, because I live poetry. He picks my feet up and lets them fall back to the table. May I ask you, he says, why the lower half of your body is perpetually standing in ice-cold water? He means energetically, of course, because the room is warm and my legs are dry. And what happened here, he asks, not waiting for an answer. He has his hand on my leg at the exact place where, when I was 4 years old, my father threw me so hard against a big oak wardrobe that I broke my femur. The bone healed 40 years ago. I was casted from the tip of my toes to my armpits for months, but Daryl is not the first healer to be able to see what happened. My father, I begin. I am not afraid of your pain, Daryl says. I am not afraid of your grief. I am not afraid of your terror. Do you want to know why I'm not afraid of your terror? I nod. I am not afraid of your terror because I have gone inside the monster, and inside the monster is pure wonder. Somewhere in this building, my friend Cindy, who I have come to Canyon Ranch with, is getting a nice, simple lavender scrub and an herbal wrap. Cindy looked through the catalog, thought, yes, the first night, maybe a nice herbal wrap after all of that travel. Pamela, Daryl says, will you tell me your father's name so that I may ask him to excuse himself from the lower half of your body? Yes, I say, and I do. Beverly, Daryl says, Beverly, you must get out of there. Beverly, he says, it does not belong to you. He has his eyes closed and his hands tight around my ankles. No, Beverly, he says more forcefully now, there are no options. We stay like that for an excruciating amount of time. Then he folds my hands across my chest and covers them with his. If you could have only one thing, he says, would you choose peace or ecstasy? Ecstasy, I think, though I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to say peace. Peace is an illusion, Daryl says. I am in the ecstasy nearly all the time now, even when I sleep. I think of Ted Olson's lonely bedroom, the terrible black sheets, the clock radio projecting blood-red digits onto the ceiling, his bald head a glinting Cabernet color like someone already dead, the musical he wrote where all the gorillas sang, whatever he is, he's alive. Pamela, Daryl says, slapping the bottom of my feet with his palms. Yes, sir, I say, out of habit. He's got my wrists now, is stretching them back over my head. No one has ever called me Pamela except my father. You have two glasses, Daryl says. One is completely full and one is completely empty. In which glass is stillness possible? The full one, I say. The questions are getting easier. Daryl now has his powerful thumbs wrapped almost completely around my uppermost vertebrae. You can get to stillness through ecstasy, he says, but you can't get to ecstasy through stillness. I think about all the ways the language of the New Age is custom-made for terrorism. I think about when a pink mouth opened in a white sky over Davis and I saw for the second time the cupped waiting hands. When one of the doing lines in your life intersects with the circle of your now, Daryl says, what happens? It has to bend, I say, confident now. It bends and eventually becomes a circle. Precisely, Daryl says, and releases his death grip on my neck. Istanbul, Turkey. This is number 60. It follows immediately. Istanbul, Turkey. At the Sultan's palace, beautiful long-limbed girl, sexy but not too sexy, lots of brassy hair, surrounded by 7 or 8 international travelers her age. To an Australian boy with acne scars, she says, "You are walking through the Topkapi Palace with 3 beautiful women. What more do you want?" The other young women are not in the same room of beautiful as she, but they accept the compliment, don't dare to interrupt. The boy says, "Maybe if you were all naked," and laughs. One of the other girls, a Swede, says, "No," meaning, "Go fuck yourself, acne face." The brassy-haired girl holds her fingers to the Swede's lips, says, "My parents taught me never to say no immediately." "To men?" the Swede asks. "To anything," she says. Istanbul is the only major city in the world that is situated on 2 continents. Since 330 AD, it has been the capital of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Latin Empire, and as recently as 1922, the Ottoman Empire. In the hilly streets, ruin leans into palace, leans into internet cafe. We are in line waiting to get into the harem. Miles of tiled, low-lit corridors and rooms so thick with ghosts of women in captivity, you can feel their hair on your arm, their jasmine-scented breath on your face. In contemporary Istanbul, the dervishes have finally invited the women to whirl. In the Blue Mosque, there are 250,000 tiles the color of sky. When the sun comes out, inside is sky and outside is golden. I am 46 years old and ashamed of the fact that this is the first mosque of my life. But later, when the evening call to prayer catches me in the garden between the Blue Mosque and the Hagia Sophia, call and echo, echo and answer, bouncing off domes and turrets that have stood on this hill for 1,500 years, I know faith springs out of doubt like topsoil, and one thing I am is here right now. Across the Golden Horn, where the Bosphorus meets the Sea of Marmara, the Asian part of the city glistens in the twilight. As a candidate for the center of everything, Istanbul beats Pueblo, Colorado, hands down. The gulls are turning cartwheels around the towers of the Blue Mosque and cawing like crazy women. Byzantium, I say to them, Constantinople. The circle of my now is wreaking havoc with the lines of my doing. I am learning to say yes, if not always immediately. A sweet-faced Turkish boy, maybe 19, offers me a Kleenex, puts both hands over his heart when I take it, says I look just like his mother when I cry. And that's number 60, just to give you an idea. So each 12 sort of ends. Like you could hear that, I'm sure, as kind of an ending. And so each 12 has its own little way of ending. This is this is not a commercial flight, so it's named with the call numbers of the airplane. N995WA. I am flying out of the Little Delta drainage, tucked illegally into the luggage area of George White's converted Super Cub. Converted, that is, to haul gear instead of a passenger. It is not that my presence puts us in danger, George assures me. I am well within the aircraft's specs, weighing, as I do, significantly less than a boned-out moose or caribou. But there is no seat for me, not to mention a belt, so my instructions are to make myself look like a duffel bag when we land in Fairbanks and wait for the all clear from George before I untangle my limbs and crawl over his seat to the door. George is one of many pilots who found their way to Alaska more or less straight from Vietnam. I once saw him break a 9-year-old boy's arm at the dinner table, right after the boy, in an attempt to get his mother's attention, put the tines of his fork through the back of her ham. I have also watched him dig through buckets of rusted nuts and bolts to find the one ancient screw that will restart a seemingly defunct airplane engine. He likes to push both the light and the equipment, landing on airstrips made of nothing but river rock between steep canyon walls deep into the Alaskan twilight. George uses a great deal of duct tape. He has gone down 3 times because of some combination of weather and equipment failure, and he has walked away each time, once for 75 miles before he hit the nearest road. His brother, who I flew with out on the coast from Dry Bay to Yakutat, the clouds forcing us so low that we could feel the spray from the breakers on the bottom of the aircraft, so low that we could watch the brown bears chasing each other off the wild strawberry patches on the beaches, had not been so lucky. His death slowed down George's adrenaline-seeking tendencies, not one iota. Normally, George flies me in and out of the backcountry in the Mall, his newest and safest plane, the only one licensed, in fact, for commercial passengers. But today the Mall is down, and so I am in the back of the ancient but trusty Cub, my knees up around my ears as the wheels leave the rocky runway. It is only about a 45-minute flight back to Fairbanks, where, in winter, pilots have to call ahead and ask the luggage handlers to chase moose off the runway. But this is September, and the tundra is red and golden below us, giving way as we head down valley to dense forest, an occasional moose standing in a little tarn carved out long ago by the glaciers. We have seen 5 big bulls since we became airborne. We are about halfway to Fairbanks when the engine sputters and quits, and George's hand jerks up to the tank control, and then his shoulders slump, and he says, "Shit." And I say, "What?" And he says, "What do you think? We're out of gas." What scares me more than anything is the violence with which he jerked his hand. For 10 or 20 seconds, we ride in the very particular silence of a small plane gradually losing altitude. And then George says, "Do you remember, like in the last few minutes, any place we could maybe put this thing down? A lake, a dirt road, even a river?" What I remember from the last few minutes are a few tiny glacial tarns and a million frost-heaved pine trees pointing drunkenly in every direction. "I don't," I say. "Here," he says, shoving the open aviation chart over the seat back toward me. "We are somewhere around in here." He indicates vaguely with his finger. "See if you can see anything up ahead, even a cut for a power line. Sometimes those are wide enough." I try to make sense of the map fast, try to ignore the fact that the treetops are getting closer. "It looks like there's some kind of dwelling to the north," I say, with a little road coming into it. And he says, "How far?" And I say, 4 or 5 miles. And he says, "I don't think we can make that." I know plenty about the need to be airborne, and plenty about how raising the degree of difficulty sweetens the pot. I understand why Alaska, and why fly-in only Alaska, and why even that isn't far out enough. I know what it's like to feel calmer, better, face-to-face with a female grizz at dusk on a caribou trail than when I'm contemplating, say, a year or a month or even a week in the significant comforts of my very own home. I know all about the anatomy of restlessness and the crossover point of adrenaline addiction, but I'm not quite ready to be accessory to George's own personal death wish, even so. "Can't hurt to try," I say. By my best guess, we are now less than 1,000 feet above the treetops. "Well," he says, "there is one other thing we could do." And I say, "What's that?" And he says, "Switch to the reserve fuel tank." And with that, he raises his hand to the little lever, switches it to the left, releases the clutch, and the single engine sputters back to life. All right. Do another airplane one. This is QV, which is Laos Air, Laotian Air, QV 501. I am looking out the rounded rectangle of the plane window at the right-hand tire at the bottom of 2 triangular struts that descend diagonally from the wing. Laos Air likes these planes with the high wings, I know, because they don't need much space to take off or land. On the tire I am looking at, there is a giant X of duct tape, which on closer examination I see is actually a patch on top of a patch, an older X of duct tape beneath it. "Look at that," I say to the Laotian beside me. We have already established that he speaks English. In fact, a few minutes ago he told me our flight to Pansavan is 7 hours late because the drug lords up in Chiang Rai needed to borrow the plane. He said it with the type of smile on his face he might have worn if he were telling me his grandmother had baked him some cookies. Now he nods his head at the tire in a similar kind of affirmation. He is well-dressed and studious-looking, a thick book on his lap, probably a government official. "That," he says, "is no problem." "It looks like a problem," I say. No, he says. "The correct way to land this plane is the left side first, then the nose, then the right side. 1, 2, 3, he says, making his hand into a little airplane. "No problem with that one there." Yesterday, in the relative safety of the tea house, Zai said, "Lao Aviation has a new director now. The old director is in..." He paused for a minute, trying, I assumed, to remember the English word. "Jail?" I offered, but the answer was Bangkok. On Laos Air, none of the tray tables stay attached to the back of the seats, and a few of the seats stay in a forward lock position, and few of the seats stay in a forward lock position. Somewhat more disturbingly, the cabin is not sealed, so soon after takeoff, when we hit some perfect combination of altitude and dew point, clouds of steam come rolling down from the overhead bins and fill the cabin. This is the point where the Westerners always scream, because to the untrained eye, the steam looks a lot like smoke. But this is my third flight on Laos Air, which makes me an old pro. Today, when the steam starts billowing in, a blonde woman in her 60s, German, I think, 2 rows in front of me, grabs the flight attendant's arm in alarm. "Air conditioning," the flight attendant says, as she must every single flight, without so much as cracking a smile. "The Chinese have the contract to service these planes," says the Laotian beside me when we have reached whatever altitude is required to cause the steam to clear. "But our government cannot pay the money, and so they do not service the planes. I think this would not happen in your country." "I think it would not," I say. "Some of these planes have not been serviced probably for 3 to 5 years. Hence the duct tape," I say, but I don't think he understands. "What do the Chinese care about some dead Laotians?" he asks. And there is that off-to-grandmother's house smile again as the plane lurches suddenly forward and begins its steep descent. Do just a couple more. Thought I would do one. We talked a little bit about dog sledding this morning, so I'll do a dog sledding one, and then I'll end with one last airplane one. This is Taylor Fort, Colorado. When I get in the car just before daylight, the outside temp says 33 degrees, as sure a sign as any that this will be the last mushing trip of the year. One of Hinsdale County's finest lets me off with a warning 10 miles south of Lake City, 48 and a 40, a stretch where the speed limit changes so many times even a local can't keep track. We take off in Becky's smallest sled, across slush that is getting ready to thaw but hasn't yet. Becky all bundled up in the sled bag, rattling on about oatmeal cookies and astrological forecasts, and man, the sled is squirrely. Every time I touch the soft brake with my foot, the nose of it wobbles 30 degrees to the left or right. The dogs are more head up than usual, more in shape and getting used less often. It takes less than a mile for me to dump the sled, the first time all year, though we had a near miss last week at the hard right turn in Tin Cup. That time I went down hard but managed to hold on, my shin grinding into the metal brake as I made the corner and righted myself again. I've got a hematoma the size of a lemon to prove it. This time, though, I get pitched clear of the sled, hit the downhill side of an ice bank nose first, and Becky goes sailing too, though her knee catches in the sled bag just long enough to tweak it. I knock the snow off my sunglasses and post-hole over to her. "You okay?" I say. "I'm upside down," she says, and it's true, and she's making no attempt to right herself. It's the first time I've seen her look less than invincible, this Annie Lennox of dog mushing, and I reach out and let her use me as an anchor to spin herself around. The dogs run on, of course, after Matt's sled, and while I help Becky hobble along the growing distance between them and us, we watch them close in on Matt at the top of the next hill. "He doesn't know yet," I say. "He doesn't know yet," as Pisces and Bella begin to nudge the backs of his knees. "Now," I say, "he knows." From our distance of more than a mile, it looks effortless, though it can't be. Matt straddling two sleds, trying to get on both hard brakes simultaneously like some kind of mad charioteer, 20 well-seasoned four-legged athletes pulling for all they're worth. He leaves his passenger, whose name is Irene, in charge of one team, and comes charging back to get us with the other. "Our hero," Becky says. Then Shredder knocks Becky over, and her knee starts to hurt for real. I don't want hurt Becky in the small sled I can't control, so Matt and I trade. The trail has been so hammered by spring snowmobilers, 100-yard stretches of it are solid speed bumps. Deep ruts alternate with ice slicks so that even in Matt's big sled, I never feel far enough from the edge. Irene and I tip over once, but nothing serious. And then the runner on Becky's sled cracks, and Matt has to go one-footed, and the sky gets all steely, and the predicted 45-mile-an-hour winds start. And that is when we decide that for three people who pride themselves on being able to read the signs, we've waited pretty long to turn around. On the way back, we go around the big hill, and I keep Matt in my virtual rearview mirror to make sure the broken runner hasn't snapped off entirely. Back at the truck, I have Irene stand on the hard brake so I can attach the gangline to the truck's bumper, and I'm just snugging it down and giving Pema and Angelina pets for being such smart lead dogs when Irene says, "What's with Roja?" I turn to see Roja in mid-seizure, on her side, tongue out, gasping for breath, getting none. I drop my gloves and leap over 6 dogs to get to her just in time to see the light fall right out of her eyes as if somebody has turned a switch. I unhook her neckline and tug line, and her head lolls to the side. I can see Matt's lead dogs rounding the last corner. "Matt," I scream, "Roja's coding." "CPR," Matt yells. I flip her over and thump on her heart with both hands. Wait half a second, thump again. "Harder," Becky screams, 1 foot already rising from Matt's sled. 2 more hard thumps, and I feel a tiny half-breath. All of a sudden, she is back behind her eyes. It is like on a cartoon, the change is so dramatic and complete. Again, Becky shouts, and I thump twice more. Then Matt is there, covering Roja's whole snout with his mouth, breathing for her. He pulls back, and she takes another small breath on her own. "I love you, Roja," he says. "I love you, Roja. Come on back." She breathes again. Her tongue is still hanging out of her mouth like a dead dog, but she is here now, when a minute ago she was not. Uh-oh. The wrong page. Sorry. I knew this was going to happen. I went to the bathroom right before I came, and I dropped all of my pages on the floor. Oh, isn't that terrible? Oh, well, it's gone. Sorry. Okay, so, and then she was okay. And then she ate some chicken, and it ended. She got better. All right. Okay, so never mind. All right, I'm going to make sure I have my pages before I do the grand finale. So sorry about that. I did. I was in the bathroom right before. I dropped all my pages. Said a bad word. Okay, hang on. Okay, here we go. All right, so I've got one more very short one, and then I've got just one more airplane story. Okay, 111 Trenton, New Jersey. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that my back hurts so much because when I was 4 and in my 3/4 body cast, my mother found it easiest to carry me around upside down like a monkey, using the plaster bar the doctors had fashioned between my knees to keep them for 3.5 months, the correct distance apart. And let's say she did just that until my second to last appointment when the orthopedic surgeon said, "You haven't been carrying her around by this bar, have you?" And my mother shot one quick glance at my father and said, "Of course not, no." And it became a funny story the two of them liked to tell together to friends over a couple of drinks. And let's say that when their friends asked, as of course they would, how in the name of heaven a 4-year-old breaks her femur, they said that I had somehow managed to pull the giant wardrobe over onto myself, except instead of wardrobe, they would have said credenza, because it would have made us sound richer than we were. I still don't see how it would make me feel any better to think of the pain in my hip and spine as anything other than my most loyal and valuable companion, the continuous non-voice in my ear that says, "You got out alive and you still get to go." No two people who have ever lived love to travel more than my mother and father. They gave that love in their fashion to me. And finally, I'll read this. This is China Air, CA 4402. The stern-faced Chinese guard has taken my backpack behind a partition, and suddenly there is a great deal of shouting. I run through its contents in my head. The 2 thangkas I bought at the School for the Preservation of Tibetan Culture, the brass soup pots from the market, the thick cords that resembled curtain poles that the nomads wrap around their heads to indicate regional loyalties, red for the East, black for the West, the hand-lettered gold leaf prayer books I bought for pennies out of an old man's satchel, Could they count as antiquities? The long string of jingle bells made for a yak. Now the shouting has moved itself back out from behind the partition and is directing itself at me. The guard wears a semi-automatic weapon and several clips of ammunition on his belt. The yelling stops, and it's my turn to speak. I don't understand you, I say. Another string of angry Chinese spews from the guard's mouth, which I interpret more or less correctly as idiot, tourist, woman. I glance at my watch. My plane is scheduled to leave in 35 minutes. My connection in Chengdu tight. Breathtakingly toxic. Even the Tibetans get dysentery there. Chengdu reminds me of the Los Angeles of Blade Runner after the sun has stopped coming out forever. It is not a place I want to get stuck. Look, I say, whatever it is, if it's a problem, keep it. I'm guessing it is my attitude, he objects to, since we cannot understand each other's words. The guard blows his whistle, 3 short tweets, and 2 more guards appear on either side of me, grab my arms firmly but not roughly, escort me to a room down the hall. They leave me sitting there a long time, long enough for me to miss my plane to Chengdu, long enough for me to miss my plane from Chengdu to Hong Kong, long enough for me to remember every detail of the film Midnight Express, the film that kept an entire generation of travelers from carrying drugs across any border, including some of us between states. A new guard knocks sharply twice on the door and enters, already yelling. He yells for several minutes, getting so close to my face that I can feel his breath on my eyeballs, but something in me refuses to cry. I don't understand you, I say, the next time he pauses, and the next time, and finally right over the top of his voice when it seems like he won't ever shut up. Startled, he raises his hand, I think maybe to hit me. And in that second, I remember the knife. A woman knife, the vendor at the market had called it, with its yak antler handle and its 4-inch blade. I had thought it would be the perfect gift for my ultra-butch house-sitter Pat. The knife, I say. I'm sorry, I didn't think. To me, it was just a souvenir. But of course, the guard can't understand any of that either. They leave me sitting another long time. I hear planes come in. I hear planes take off. At one point, I realize the windows are made of one-way glass. Finally, a man wearing a suit comes in. He grunts at me to rise, to follow, so I do. Back in security, he thrusts my backpack at me and hands me a boarding pass. I go through security again without incident. My woman knife, of course, is gone. Everything is broken on China Air Flight 4402, and the toilet reeks, and the 5 Chinese I am slammed into the middle seats with will not stop spitting onto the carpet. But compared to 5 years of hard labor at a Tibetan prison, it pretty much rocks. As the plane bumps along the mountainous air currents, I think about my father, about the time I was 17 and my mother went away for a week and left me in charge of his meals. One day I was racing home from my friend's house on my bike, hoping to get there before he did, and he drove his Cadillac right up behind me on the sidewalk and laid on the horn. And even after that, it might have been okay because dinner was only supposed to be assembled cold cuts on rye bread and tomato salad. I dropped my bike on the lawn and ran into the kitchen before he could get out of the car, but he came in just as I was opening a new jar of mayo and grabbed my shirt in the front and pinned me up against the wall and raised his hand in the same exact way the Chinese guard had. And I said, for the first time ever, if you do this, I will tell everyone you know. And my father let go the front of my shirt and went in and turned on the Phillies game. When we begin to descend, the flight attendant comes over the ancient speaker in a demonic whisper, and the cabin gets so animated I think we must be about to crash. But then I remember reading that the descent off the Tibetan plateau to Chengdu is the steepest of any commercial flight path, even Potosi, Bolivia, where you plummet right past the face of one of the 15 Christs in South America that claim to be the world's largest. And before I know, we are on the ground. Miraculously, I have not missed the last flight of the day from Chengdu to Hong Kong. And when I go to the gate, a new boarding pass appears. Stepping onto the air... Oh, no! Oh, no! I can't believe it happened again. Now, wait. We're going to find it this time. There it is. God, wouldn't that have been awful? Stepping onto the Air Hong Kong jet is stepping squarely back into the first world. And when the flight attendant in her stylish purple suit and jaunty tam asks me what I would like to drink, I look at her twice to make sure she isn't kidding. 1 country, 2 systems, the customs official said to me when I left Hong Kong 2 weeks ago. And boy, he can say that again. Just after we land beside the carnival neon of the Hong Kong skyline, The co-pilot heads down the aisle toward me with a look that tells me he has me in his sights. I suck in my breath as he stops in front of me and extends his hands. "Your knife, madam," he says, bowing deeply. "Thank you very much," I say, and I lift it from his hands. I'd be happy to answer a few questions if there are some. Yes. Uh-huh. Mexican Hat? I was running the San Juan River and stopping at the San Juan Friendship Inn for Navajo tacos and vanilla milkshakes, specifically. That's what I was doing in Mexican Hat. Now, not Medicine Hat, which is different. Mexican Hat. One of these days, that hat is going to fall into the river, and then everybody's going to wonder why it's called Mexican Hat. There's a big rock that looks like a Mexican hat, but it's weathering, and probably in our lifetimes, that thing's going to fall over. And then everyone's going to wonder where the name came from. Yes?
I'm stunned at how you remember dialogue. Is it something you write down? You have a memory for dialogue, or you?
Well, this is a novel, as I mentioned. But I have a pretty good memory for dialogue. But of course, you always make it better. I mean, the beautiful thing about it being a novel is I'm so much quicker in retrospect, like we all are. But I take notes now. You know, I used to say before I turned 40, I used to say, oh, well, if it's important, I'll remember it. And then, of course, that stops being true. So now I take pretty good notes when because I'm on airplanes so much, and I'm very proud of this in true George Clooney fashion. I'm going to turn over 1 million miles on United very soon, not tomorrow, but sometime in the next month. And so I have this rule that when the pilot always says, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're about 20 minutes from landing, or in 20 minutes we're going to start our descent, so you should go to the bathroom now. If you pay attention, they always say that. And so from that point until we land, I have to take notes. Like I have to remember. I have to sit down and go, okay, what's happened lately? And I make my notes. And that's like my new rule of traveling. It's the way I offset the punishing voice that says, you travel so much, you're not really a writer. So that's like the way I say no, but every time the pilot says that, then I always have an opportunity to catch up with stuff that I've been trying to remember, that I've been trying to hold up here. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Peggy. The title is Contents May Have Shifted. I didn't get to the airplane story that announces the title. It's later on. But it's called Contents May Have Shifted, and it is going to be released on January 17th, 2012. Yes? Did you say chronologically or achronologically? I understand. I shouldn't have asked you that. I understand the question. I just never heard anyone say achronologically before. I was interested in the word. It is. Yeah, I did not write it in the order that it's in, but I didn't write it in any other order either. That's the truth. I wrote it. I'll tell you a few things about it, which is not exactly what you're asking me, but by way of answering, there are characters that like there's Pam, the protagonist, has she has sort of one love interest in the first third of the book, and his name is Corey. I didn't read about the guys because it's too confusing. I read so out of order tonight. I mean, the idea would be you could really read in any order. Like, that would be ideal. People could just shout out numbers and it would all work out. So I tried to sort of focus on the dad stuff tonight because I wanted to read a bunch of airplane stories. So there's a love interest named Corey, and he's in the first third of the book. And then there's this kind of internet dating, horrible middle. And then there's a somewhat better love interest at the end of the book named Rick. And so in that sense, and hopefully Pam figures it out. So that's kind of the line. Plus her back gets better. And that's kind of the line. You know, that's the narrative pull. But there's not much. And then when you say chronologically, like there's a kind of a loose chronology here. But there's a trip to Tibet and a trip to Tunisia that are spread over like 3 different groups of 12 because of their thematic content. As I said earlier today, I have all these rules that it was impossible to follow all my own rules at once, which was really exciting. I mean, this is why I love to write, because it's like a puzzle. But one reason. But then I have things, for instance, like that flight in The Cub, when that man, whose name was not George White, pretended that we were out of gas. That happened years ago, you know, but it belonged in this book. So I just pulled it up. And there's a few other things. There's a few other Alaska things in particular back from the days I got to spend lots of time there that have come into this book that really are no part of this particular Pam's life except 20 years ago. So while there's a kind of a loose chronology, there's all these other rules operating too that work against the chronology, like the idea that you can't have the 2 of the same town in one group of 12. It really is. It's very weird in my head right now. It makes me wonder like what'll happen if I want to write something that's just linear, like because I'm so used to now thinking in these broken pieces. But I think I will next. I think the next thing I write will be linear, because I've had as much fun as you can have with these pieces, really. And even now, like today when I was going through trying to pick out a few things to read, I saw one that's out of place that I'm going to move tonight. I won't be able to do this after Tuesday. But I've moved them so many times in so many orders, it's unbelievable. And, you know, there's a really good reason for almost any positioning of them. It's just a series of good reasons in trying to decide. But the last time I read it through, which was, you know, about literally like maybe the 150th time I've read it through, the last time I read it through, I tried to really focus on this idea of a wave, like the build, the wave, like the thing that's satisfying in a traditional way, to make sure that wave was rolling big enough. And I think it's about right now. When I first started this book, I was like, I don't want any arc. I don't, you know. I had my poet head on, because as I mentioned, I love the poets and I wanted to be one, but I'm not one. So in the end, this push for narrative happened, and I went ahead and let it. I didn't resist it at the end, this push for sort of traditional resolution of some kind. But it was a balancing act the whole time. So no, not chronological and not achronological either. And sometimes it was a matter of just, you know, sometimes it was really a more thematic organization too. Like I thought, oh, that trip that I took way back when on Where would fit into this 12, you know. Mm-hmm.
Is your main character ever question why she travels? Like, is it for money? Is it economic, like for work, or is it karmic, or is it for adventure, or like exactly why she travels?
Oh, you said karmic. I thought you said karmic, like Toyota. Like I was like, karmic. Sure. I mean, she travels because her parents taught her to travel. I mean, that was in there. But if you're asking me, is she a writer? Like, is it that sort of excuse, you know? Kinda. I mean, I wrote to my editor, who I like very, very much. We said all these wonderful things about Carol Smith earlier, and I'm now working with Elaine Mason, who is very, very wonderful too at Norton. And in the middle of all this editing and so much moving and so much rethinking the big questions and all of that, I wrote, and I said, should I just change her name? Like, should we just get over ourselves and just change her name and make her, you know, a cosmetic sale? Like, should we just give this up? And Elaine said, no. We want everyone to think she is Pam and she's not Pam. That's exactly what we want everyone to think. So people are going to know why she travels. She travels because writers travel. you know. I do say something like that at some point, but it's really more of a fear of staying put. Like, if I stay put, the past will catch me. And my parents were always running. Her parents were always running. And they taught me to run, too. So that's all in there as well. So there's like the little reason and the big reason. So the big reason is that she's always going to some conference, or she's always going to teach something, or she's writing a story on whatever. And then the bigger reason is this need to move and move and move and move. So whatever doesn't catch up. And I think both of those things are in there. Yeah.
How do you deal with the fact that although it's a novel, some people might see themselves in it, perhaps relatives, and not care for how it is portrayed?
You love the Midwest, don't you? They wouldn't care for it. Well, my parents are dead. I mean, I'll say that right off the bat. And I don't think I would have written this book in this way if they weren't. Although they would have told you before they died. I took plenty of shots at them before this. But they're gone now. So that's one reason this book is the way it is. There are other characters in this book, more legitimately, that I'm concerned a little bit about hurting their feelings, more than any outcome. You know, I think I've done a good job disguising people. Like other people won't necessarily recognize them. You know, though they will know perhaps it's them. Sometimes people don't. Sometimes it's quite amazing because everything I've ever written has been autobiographical. You know, there's no news about that, and I say so in rooms like this all over. So it's amazing to me that some people don't recognize themselves when it seems so obvious, you know, but people's tendency toward denial is vast and helpful for us writers. There's one person in this book who, and I do what I call a compassion read at the end, which is strictly, it's, you know, I read the book 1,000 times, but this one read is just to see, like, who I have been really shitty to and could I have avoided it? You know, it really is. Like, who do I want to be in the world? And, you know, I'm from New Jersey, and we say what we think there. And my partner is not, and, you know, his family's really polite. And so I'm always being told how mouthy I am. But in truth, I take this process really seriously, of like this compassion read. But by the same token, you know, it's my obligation as a writer not to nicen things up. I really feel strongly about that too. So in the case of this one person who's in this book, who I didn't read a single word about her tonight, though I have in other places, I finally moved her. I changed cities for her, which in this book was more meaningful than in another book. Like that's just the thing we do as writers, you know, we want to disguise someone's identity, so instead of Tucson, they're from Idaho, you know, and that's an easy fix. But in this book, because this book is all about place, and everything is tied to the place so intricately, to move her really makes a big difference. So I moved her from Santa Fe to Boulder, which I hate because I love Boulder. And I take lots of shots at the city this woman is from. And now it's Boulder. And I really, I might have mentioned, dislike Santa Fe. But anyway, I had to do it. So I moved her to Boulder, and I did another thing. I made her kind of sexy, you know, and it's that old Annie Lamott joke, which I'm sure you've heard about, you know, if you're trying to disguise your old boyfriend, give him a really big, and, you know, because then he'll never complain. I sort of did the inverse of that. I made her really pretty and really sexy, which is what the real life equivalent of this woman wants to be more than anything. So then I could also do the other things I wanted to do with her character. And she just seems more well-rounded now. Like, and she's also a little bit prophetic. She's sort of weirdly prophetic, which she is not in real life. So I really did. She was the hard one in this book. You know, there's always a hard one. And she was the hard one because she's really important to the book. And it's important that she's really duplicitous. But I tried to give her some good qualities. to sort of make up for it that she doesn't actually have in real life. But it's hard. I mean, it's hard. I mean, to answer your question more generally, it's very hard. It's the hardest thing about doing this. But when I'm writing, I'm trying so hard to get at some sort of truth. I don't mean the truth, the big truth. I just mean like my truth, my truth of what it means to be alive on the planet. And that involves a lot of autobiographical writing. And it also involves, like the lawyer always tells me, just tell them you made it up. Well, I can't do that. Like, I can't work that hard to tell the truth and then stand in front of all of you and go, oh, yes, this bears no resemblance to my real life. I'd be such an asshole to do that. So anyway, so it's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing. I have lost friends, not many. A lot of people like me because, because I'm the way I am. Like the people who still like me after all these years, they kind of like me for how I am. And but I've had some tricky situations because of it, and it's hard. It's the hardest thing. It's the single hardest thing. There's no question about it. Yeah?
So most of what you write is autobiographical.
Yes.
But you change it.
Yes.
Make it novelist, basically.
Well, here's the real, and I'm glad you asked me that, because I say sort of flippant things about it as if everybody lives inside my head. Here's what happens, and this happens no matter what the book is, no matter what it's called. It could be an essay I'm writing for a magazine. There's some magazine editors here. It could be a novel. It could be a poem. Not that I write poems. It could be anything. Like, I always start with my personal experience. And that could just be as a witness. It doesn't have to be about me, but like I witnessed a sky burial in Tibet. That seemed like a good occasion to write some stuff down. Me as witness or me as participant. So everything starts with things I have experienced with my own senses. That's important to me. Because I try to write really sensory stuff. Then I make it better, than it really happened in some way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean exaggerating it. Sometimes it means actually quieting it down, because sometimes the things that happen in real life are too perfect to work in a story, because people would go, well, you just made that up, and I don't believe it, So then I shape it, I really think of myself as, making like a pot, making an art object. And that might mean changing some stuff. And then later on, it might mean changing some stuff to protect people's feelings or protect myself legally or, whatever that might mean. Or it might mean, changing stuff because day 4 of a 5-day river trip, nothing happened. So let's make it a 4-day river trip and have a better story, I got a little confused about that early on, I think, just because of several experiences I had, working with magazines where, I'll just tell you them really quick because they're funny. The first one was when I was right out of grad school, and I believed, only that, something was a table because you called it a table, because that's what happens in grad school, like language is all. And I got asked to write a story for a Working Woman magazine. And they wanted to know why women over 40 took adventure vacations. And I was like 28, and I didn't have any idea. So I called, 3 women I knew who had climbed Kilimanjaro or whatever, and they said, for the challenge and other uninteresting things. And then I made up 3 women who said really funny things, really great things, about why they took adventure vacations. And I turned in the article. And then the fact checker called me. And and of course I was right out of grad school, so I was like, you're a what? Like, I mean, really, I was exactly how you are when you get out of grad school. I was like, you believe in facts? And so she asked for the names and phone numbers of the 6 women, and I told her, the first 3, and then she said, well, what about Samantha and Kathy? I said, well, I made those up. And she paused for a second. She said, well, I guess we don't have to call them then. And I won't tell the other story because it's getting late, but I had several experiences with magazines in a row where they were like, yeah, could you make it rain a little less? We didn't want it to rain that much in France. So I didn't really get that it mattered. Now all this Jim Fry, et cetera, later, I see that some people think it does matter. But I really thought for about a decade it didn't matter. I thought everybody wanted a little art object, even in their Travel and Leisure article on France. And I was honestly misguided about that. And then I had a really hard time correcting, and obviously still do. So that's what I do. I take experience, I shape it. If they want to call it a novel, that's great with me because that makes me feel comfortable, because then all the changes I've made are fine. Okay, well, maybe one more real quick one. I don't want you to sit here longer than you.
When did you start writing? Like when you were in third grade, or?
I started writing really young, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know when. I learned to read when I was 2.5. I said earlier today, it's really true. I had a godmother named Martha Washington who taught me how to read. And I wrote really soon after that, and I've always been writing. Like, I don't remember a time before writing, honestly. Thank you so much for being so patient.